It's an honor as well as a pleasure to introduce Ambassador John Bolton. Your programs give you a bare outline of some of his many accomplishments in his long career of public service, his important work at the State Department, at the Department of Justice, and as that rarest of figures, a pro-American voice of sanity at the United Nations. I hope that's for sanity and not for the United Nations. What your programs do not indicate is a quality that Mr. Bolton's admirers especially prize. I mean John Bolton's courage and willingness to speak not only truth to power, but truth to the rancid forces of political correctness and anti-American animus. How refreshing it was to have a State Department delegate describe Kim Jong-il as a tyrannical dictator and observe frankly that under Kim's rule, life in North Korea was a hellish nightmare. Now, he was not congratulated for that, but it was the truth. And how splendid that our ambassador to the United Nations should observe that there is no such thing as the United Nations. There is only the international community, which can only be led by the only remaining superpower, which is the United States. My only quibble with Ambassador Bolton's wary attitude toward the UN concerns his observation that the Secretariat building in New York has 38 stories. If you lost 10 stories today, it wouldn't make a bit of difference. I would have put the number rather higher myself. Well, we live in an age when the fatuous call for global governance is enjoying a new lease on life, not only in the corridors of the United Nations and the European Union, but also in the hallways in and about 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. The assault on national sovereignty and American liberties is proceeding on many fronts on issues from the environment to tax policy to gun control and national security. It is not at all beyond the realm of possibility that Americans could one day be answering to unelected and unaccountable officials in Brussels or The Hague on these and other issues. What we are facing is an international attack on limited government whose ultimate object is the absorption of the United States into a European-style socialist superstate. John Bolton has been one of our most strenuous, articulate, and effective advocates for American national sovereignty and the liberties it guarantees. Please join me in welcoming Ambassador John Bolton.
Well, thank you very much, Roger, and thank all of you for coming today. And I wanted to thank the panelists this morning, too, for a series of really interesting, fascinating discussions on a wide variety of subjects relating to the question of individual liberty and initiative. Roger's asked me to look at this from an international context, which I think is important to do, both for what it says about our own country and for what it says about the threats we face from around the world. And by coincidence, or maybe not, today is the 21st anniversary of East Germany's decision to open its frontier with the West. And obviously that was a signal moment in our history, given that really reflected the beginning of the end of the Cold War, followed just a little bit over 2 years later on December the 31st, 1991, when the Soviet Union itself was dissolved into its constituent republics. Now, the end of the Cold War produced a lot of jubilation, reflecting what some would call the vindication of the Whig theory of history that progress is we're always moving forward and so on, something we all fall prey to. But it was particularly evident after the collapse of the Warsaw Pact and the Soviet Union. People were writing things about the end of history because obviously democracy and the free market had triumphed, and there wasn't anything else left. It was all over. We had won, and so there were no further threats. Turns out not surprisingly, that that's not true, and that whatever our views here in the United States, there are a lot of other people in the rest of the world who actually don't share the Washington consensus and aren't wild about representative government and the markets. And that leads us into a debate about exactly how we're going to respond to those other governments and their supporters, and why I think it's critical for us not to take the utilitarian arguments in favor of individual freedom as the only important arguments, important though they are. The utilitarian argument basically, for markets at least in particular, is this is how you maximize national wealth, liberty, and all things bright and beautiful. I certainly believe that, but it does nag at me from time to time that maybe the utilitarian argument doesn't always capture what's going on, at least in the short term being defined as several generations of human life. I think it's important to remember the moral argument for individual liberty as well, even if in any given period of history it doesn't seem to be working out quite as well as it should. And to me, the moral argument was best put, although I don't think he intended to put it this way, by a Brit named John Ruskin, who in 1870 wrote the following: "One evening when I was yet in my nurse's arms, I wanted to touch the tea urn, which was boiling merrily. My nurse would have taken me away from the urn, but my mother said, 'Let him touch it.' So I touched it, and that was my first lesson in liberty." Now, Ruskin, when he wrote that, was a socialist, and my guess is that his remedy, or at least the Obama remedy today, would be a national commission on tea urns and steps to take care of innocent children from callous mothers and all the rest of it. I viewed it, though, as a central insight into what liberty means for us, which is not merely the liberty to make decisions and succeed and do well, but the liberty to fail, too. Because markets are not good just when they're going up and turn bad when they go down. That is the nature of markets, and I would say human life more generally. And the moral component of liberty, I think, is particularly important to us when we look around the world, because I think there's a lot of bad news out there about the utilitarian side of totalitarian and authoritarian states. You know, they don't do badly sometimes when it comes to mobilizing resources and posing threats. Now, you know, in the 20th century, we looked at the first two world wars. I described a moment ago the successful end of the Third World War, the Cold War. We look at the first two, the defeat of Germany and the Central Powers in World War I, and the defeat of Nazism and the Axis powers in World War II, and then the Third World War defeat of communism. And it looks like a pretty good century. You know, we're 3-0, and the bad guys aren't doing that well. I just want to suggest it didn't turn out that way as easily as we remember it. You know, if Hitler had been a little less greedy, if he had restrained himself from attacking the Soviet Union, if he had consolidated his power over Europe and focused on Great Britain instead of launching the attack against Stalin's Soviet Union, it might well have turned out differently. If the Russians had not been bled so badly in World War II, they might have been able to hold on to their empire. We forget that one of the consequences of World War II was the end of the European colonial empires, caused because Britain was on its back after the war economically. France really never qualified as a major player in the war. The Dutch had been wiped out. And ultimately, the collapse of the Soviet Empire, which is what happened in 1991, was launched on the way by the massive human and economic cost of World War II. These are factors that ought to give us a little bit of pause when we look ahead at the challenges that we face around the world, and that our precepts of representative government and free market economies face as well. I just want to run through, in the time we have, several examples of this so that we can begin to think about what it means to both preserve our own system of liberty and continue to maximize it versus these other visions, not all of them necessarily threats in the immediate short term, but these other visions that are out there. And let me start, perhaps improbably for some, with the European Union. I'm not a big fan of the idea that self-government in Europe is as democratic or as free and open as it is here in the United States. Number one, most European systems are parliamentary. They don't have separation of powers. You win a majority in Parliament, you control the executive branch. So much for the tension we see between President and Congress. And even in countries like France, where the Constitution of the Fifth Republic has a strong president and a strong parliament, it was always intended or envisioned that in most cases they would govern in the same party. Moreover, by and large, the parliamentary systems use proportional representation. They don't have their representatives tied to geographic constituencies. They run on the basis of party lists that are comprised by or put together by the leaders of the party at the national level. I leave the UK out of this for the moment, so that if a party gets 8.9% of the national vote, it gets 8.9% of the representation in Parliament, according to a list that the average voters had nothing to do with it. So do people vote for governments in Europe? Sure they do. Are they as robust and democratic and open as they are in the United States? I don't think so. You know, we still in many states vote for judges and vote to recall judges. I think that's a good thing. I could see a little of that at the federal level as an experiment from time to time. The Europeans are horrified that we vote for judges. So starting from what I think is a different basis in many respects, now look at the phenomenon of the European Union, which encompasses virtually all of the domestic policy decisions of the member governments, conducted in Brussels in mass meetings of diplomats and bureaucrats from around the European Union, with next to no transparency or visibility, certainly next to no democratic accountability on the part of the people who actually live in the European Union. The figures were compiled in Britain some time back, and they're absolutely shocking. They vary a little bit depending on who you're listening to, but something like between 2/3 and 90% of all the legislation that Parliament passes today is simply enacting into UK law decisions that have already been made in Brussels. Now that is phenomenal. And in other countries, I'm sure the percentage is roughly the same. That's why in Europe today they talk about the democratic deficit, because none of the members of the so-called executive of the European Union are elected by anybody other than other government bureaucrats. The European Parliament is, if I may say so, a joke that has virtually no influence over the workings of the European Union, and it doesn't look like that's going to change unless we see the breakup of the Eurozone, which I don't put as being beyond question. But here you've got largely democratic societies creating a structure that is fundamentally anti-democratic and living with it very happily in ways that perhaps weren't intended at the outset of the European Union, but which continues to progress in a direction that I think most Americans would be profoundly disturbed with. And I think that's one of the reasons, among several, why the European Union has moved away from the United States over time, because these are people who see their interest in what happens in Brussels and the governance of the European Union as being divorced from the interest of the nation states that make it up. Let me turn now to Russia, which which may be the first example, or certainly the biggest example that I can think of a country that started with a totalitarian, or in its later days, authoritarian government, passed out of that into a form of democracy.